Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, Chapter 9, Inequality of Capital Ownership. Part 1, The Other Inequality, Who Owns the Wealth? In Chapter 8, we spent a long time inside the world of labor income. The wages, the salaries, the bonuses, the gap between the cleaner and the chief executive, the super manager and the minimum wage worker. And we found that this world is already deeply, structurally unequal. But here is the thing. Labor income inequality, dramatic as it is modest compared to what Piketty is about to show us. Because Chapter 9 moves to the other world, the world of capital ownership. And the inequality of capital ownership makes the inequality of labor income look almost quaint by comparison. Let me give you the key number immediately, so it frames everything that follows. In most wealthy countries, the top 10% of income earners receive somewhere between 25 and 35% of total labor income. That is substantial inequality. But the top 10% of wealth holders own somewhere between 50 and 90% of all capital. 50 to 90%. Capital is not just more unequal than labor income. It is in a completely different category of concentration. And the bottom 50%. The bottom half of the population in most wealthy countries owns approximately 5% of total wealth, sometimes less. 5% for half the people. If you walked into a room of 100 people representing the wealth distribution of a typical wealthy country, 50 of them would together be sharing 5 chairs out of 100. The other 95 chairs would belong to the 50 people on the other side of the room. And of those 50, 10 people would be sitting on between 50 and 90 of those chairs. That is the world Chapter 9 describes. Let us understand how it got this way and what it means. To understand capital inequality, you first need to understand something that seems obvious but is frequently forgotten. Capital inequality is the accumulated result of income inequality, compounded over time, filtered through inheritance. It is not a separate phenomenon. It is the long-run consequence of income flows that consistently favor some people over others, accumulating year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. Think of it this way. If you earn a high income and save a significant fraction of it, your wealth grows. If your children inherit that wealth and also earn high incomes and also save, the wealth grows further. Compounding. Now add in the fact that the rate of return on capital, the percentage gain on invested wealth, is higher for larger fortunes, as we discussed in earlier chapters. Harvard's endowment earns 8 to 9% per year. A small savings account earns near zero. The wealthy accumulate capital faster, not just because they save more, but because their capital grows faster. The arithmetic of compound returns is ruthless and patient. And then add inheritance. Each generation starts where the previous one ended. If your parents accumulated capital, you begin adult life with a head start. If they did not, you begin from zero or below zero, weighed down by student debt. Layer these 3 mechanisms: high incomes, higher returns on larger fortunes, inheritance, and you get the capital distribution that Piketty documents. Not a conspiracy, just arithmetic applied consistently over long periods in a system where the rules favor those who already have. Piketty makes a distinction in Chapter 9 that is essential for understanding what follows. He separates the question of how concentrated capital is from the question of what kind of capital it is. In the 19th century, capital inequality was primarily about land and the returns from large agricultural estates. The Bennett family in Jane Austen's Pride and prejudice worrying about the entail on their estate. The Russian landowner in Tolstoy living off serf labor. By the early 20th century, it was primarily about industrial capital and financial instruments, railway shares, government bonds, colonial investments. Today, capital inequality has several distinct components that manifest differently and affect different people differently. There is housing capital, the family home, and for the wealthier, investment properties. There is financial capital, shares, bonds, pension funds, savings accounts. There is business capital, ownership stakes in private companies. And there is what economists are beginning to call intangible capital, intellectual property, brand value, proprietary algorithms, network effects in platform businesses. Each of these has a different distribution pattern, different tax treatment, different relationship to democratic politics. Understanding which type of capital you are talking about matters enormously for understanding who holds it, how it generates returns, and what policies might affect its distribution. Let me anchor this historically with the French data that Piketty knows best. In France in 1810, the concentration of capital was extraordinary. The top 10% owned approximately 80 to 85% of all wealth. The top 1% owned 50 to 60%. The bottom 50% owned essentially nothing, 1 or 2% at most. This was a world in which capital, primarily land, and the financial instruments held by the aristocracy and the emerging bourgeoisie, was radically concentrated in a tiny fraction of the population. The revolution had redistributed some aristocratic land, but wealth finds ways of reconcentrating. And by 1810, with Napoleon's stabilization of property rights and the reassertion of bourgeois property norms, the concentration was back near its pre-revolutionary level. Through the 19th century, French capital concentration remained extraordinary. In 1910, on the eve of the First World War, the top 10% still owned approximately 80 to 85% of French wealth. A century of industrialization, of economic growth, of expanding middle classes had barely dented the fundamental concentration of capital. The bourgeoisie had joined the aristocracy at the top, but the bottom did not rise. The middle grew somewhat. The top remained dominant. Then, as we have discussed in previous chapters, the catastrophes of the 20th century intervened. War, inflation, depression, nationalization, progressive taxation. By 1970, the top 10% share of French wealth had fallen to approximately 50%. Still a majority, still a dramatic concentration, but dramatically lower than 1910. The middle 40%, the people between the 50th and 90th percentile, had seen their wealth share grow significantly. This is what Piketty calls the emergence of the patrimonial middle class. The middle class that owns a home, that has a pension, that has some savings, that has a small car and perhaps a modest investment portfolio. Not wealthy in the Belle Epoque sense, but not propertyless either. A middle class with some capital, with something to lose, with a stake in the system. And then, from 1980 onward, the concentration began rising again, gradually, persistently, driven by exactly the mechanisms we have been discussing throughout the book. The top share rising, the middle holding more or less steady but increasingly anxious, the bottom still holding almost nothing. The key political implication of this trajectory is that the patrimonial middle class is the swing player. They are the group whose capital has grown enough to give them a stake in the system, but who remain far behind the wealthy. Their political orientation, toward redistribution or against it, toward taxing capital or protecting it, may well determine the political economy of the 21st century. Part 2. Inheritance and the Weight of the Dead. Let us now talk about inheritance. Because inheritance is the mechanism by which capital concentration reproduces itself across generations. And it is one of the most politically sensitive topics in the entire inequality debate. In most wealthy societies, there is a deep cultural ambivalence about inheritance. On one hand, people feel strongly that parents should be allowed to provide for their children, that the desire to leave something behind, to build something that outlasts you, is a fundamental human motivation. On the other hand, inheritance is the most direct mechanism by which starting position determines outcome, by which luck of birth trumps merit and effort, by which the children of the wealthy prosper regardless of their talents, and the talented children of the poor face structural headwinds. Piketty enters this debate with data. And the data tells a striking story. Inheritance flows, the total value of wealth transferred between generations, were enormous in the 19th century, enormous in the Belle Epoque. They collapsed in the mid-20th century as war and taxation destroyed and redistributed wealth. And they are now rising again, rapidly. Inheritance is making a comeback. The numbers for France are illuminating. In 1820, annual inheritance flows in France were equivalent to approximately 20 to 25% of national income. What does that mean in practice? It means that the wealth transferred between generations each year, through death and gifts, was equal to roughly a quarter of everything the French economy produced in that year. A staggering share. It means that, for a significant fraction of the population, what they inherited was the primary determinant of their economic position, more important than what they earned, more important than their education or their effort. Birth was destiny. Then through the 20th century, as accumulated wealth was compressed by war and taxation, inheritance flows fell dramatically. By the 1950s, they were around 4 to 5% of national income, a tiny fraction of what they had been. For the first time in history, what you earned in your lifetime began to matter more than what you were born into. The meritocracy, imperfect, partial but real, was born in this compression. And now, Piketty's data shows inheritance flows in France rising again, from that low of 4 to 5% in the 1950s back toward 12 to 15% of national income by 2010. And the trajectory, absent intervention, points back toward the Belle Epoque levels of 20% and above within a generation or two. The meritocracy is not dying, but it is being squeezed. Inheritance is becoming more important again. Birth is reasserting its primacy over effort. Let us make this concrete with a modern example. The housing inheritance in Britain. If you bought a house in London in 1970, you paid perhaps £10,000 to £15,000. That same house today is likely worth £1,200,000, maybe more. The person who bought that house is now in their 80s or 90s. When they die, they leave their children a £1,000,000 asset. Their children did nothing to generate that wealth. They did not work for it. They did not invest wisely. They simply waited. And they are now, by virtue of inheritance alone, entering middle age with a £1,000,000 capital asset that their peers without such parents do not have. In Britain, inheritance from property is now the primary means by which the middle class transmits wealth across generations. The Resolution Foundation has estimated that, by the 2030s, inheritances and gifts will account for more than a quarter of total household wealth accumulation in Britain. More than a quarter coming from family transfers, not from work, not from saving, from death. This is the world Piketty is describing. Not fully returned to the Belle Epoque, but moving in that direction, and moving fast. There is a remarkable economic phenomenon, associated with rising inheritance that Piketty documents carefully. He calls it the comeback of inherited wealth relative to earned wealth. In the 19th century and Belle Epoque, it made more sense, economically, rationally, to inherit wealth than to work for it. Because the return on inherited capital was higher than the income achievable through labor, even at senior professional levels. Balzac's Vautrin told Rastignac this in 1835. You will never earn through work what you can receive through inheritance or marriage. Then came the mid-20th century compression, and for a few decades, the situation genuinely reversed. Earned income from education, from professional careers, could generate lifetime wealth comparable to or exceeding what many people inherited, because the wealth being inherited had been compressed by war and taxation. This was the era of the self-made man, the grammar school boy who became a barrister or a surgeon. Real but also exceptional and fading. As inheritance flows recover toward their historical levels, the economic logic of Vautrin is reasserting itself. In Piketty's projections, if current trends continue, people born in the 1970s and 1980s in France will, on average, receive inheritances that exceed what they can reasonably expect to accumulate through a lifetime of work. The era of meritocracy, brief, partial, historically exceptional, may be ending. The inheritance society may be returning. And the political consequences of this are profound. Meritocracy, even when imperfect, provides a legitimating narrative for inequality. The story goes, yes, outcomes are unequal, but the inequality reflects differences in effort and talent. Everyone has a fair chance. The system rewards contribution. This narrative is politically powerful because it connects inequality to ideas about fairness and desert that most people share. But the narrative requires some correspondence with reality to maintain credibility. If the primary determinant of your economic position is not your talent or your effort, but who your parents were and what they owned, the meritocratic narrative breaks down. And when it breaks down, people look for other explanations, other narratives. Sometimes those narratives are constructive. Progressive politics that correctly identifies structural inequality and proposes redistributive solutions. Sometimes they are destructive. Populist politics that identifies scapegoats, immigrants, minorities, cosmopolitan elites, as the source of economic insecurity rather than the structural forces Piketty describes. The rise of inheritance inequality is not just an economic fact, it is a political tinderbox. And we are living in the smoke. One historical aside that I find genuinely fascinating. The attitude of the American founding generation toward inherited wealth was actually quite radical. Thomas Jefferson was deeply hostile to the European model of hereditary aristocracy. He wrote that the earth belongs to the living, that each generation should not be bound by the debts and property arrangements of the previous one. He advocated for laws that would prevent the indefinite accumulation of wealth across generations. Jefferson's concern was not primarily about economic equality in the modern sense. It was about Republican self-governance, about preventing the emergence of an American aristocracy that would corrupt democratic institutions, as he believed European aristocracies had corrupted European ones. His contemporary, the revolutionary pamphleteer Thomas Paine, went further. In his 1797 pamphlet Agrarian Justice, Paine argued for a universal inheritance, a lump sum payment to every citizen upon reaching adulthood, funded by a tax on inherited property. A universal basic inheritance in 1797. Paine was 2 centuries ahead of his time. His proposal is remarkably similar to proposals that serious economists make today, including Piketty himself in his later work, as a response to rising inheritance inequality. The idea that everyone should start adult life with some capital stake, not identical to what the wealthy inherit, but enough to provide real choices, is one of the most substantive policy proposals in the modern inequality debate. Thomas Paine got there first. Part 3: The Rentier Returns. One of the most vivid and recurring concepts in capital in the 21st century is the rentier. The person who lives off the returns from capital, who does not work, who does not contribute to production, who simply holds wealth and collects the income it generates. Dividends, interest, rent. In popular discourse, the rentier is often presented as an archaic figure, a relic of the pre-industrial world, the aristocrat with his agricultural estate collecting ground rent from tenant farmers. Or perhaps a slightly vulgar Edwardian figure clipping bond coupons in a private bank, too grand to work but too anxious about money to stop counting it. Piketty's central argument in Chapter 9 is that the rentier is not disappearing. The rentier is coming back. Not in the same form, not in the same social guise. But in terms of economic function, living off capital returns without working, the 21st century is producing a new rentier class, and it is producing it faster than most people recognize. Let me give you the defining arithmetic of the rentier. If you hold capital worth 50 times the average annual income, 50 times, which sounds enormous but is the level Piketty identifies as the threshold for genuine rentier status, and if that capital earns a 5% real return, you receive 2.5 times the average income every year simply from the returns on your capital. Without working, your capital income exceeds what a very successful professional earns. You do not need to work. More precisely, you choose whether to work. Work becomes an option, not a necessity. And because you can afford the best advisors, the best investment managers, the most diversified and sophisticated portfolio, your returns are likely above average, perhaps 7 or 8% rather than 5. Which means your capital income is not 2.5 times the average. It might be 3 or 4 times. And each year, because you consume less than you earn from capital, the capital grows. The income next year is higher, the year after higher still. Piketty's R greater than G is not just a formula. This is what it looks like in practice. The rentier's wealth accumulates faster than the economy grows, year after year, decade after decade. The gap between the rentier and everyone else widens, automatically, without effort, simply by virtue of the mathematics of compound returns on large capital. In the Belle Epoque world, rentiers were socially visible. They had a distinct identity. They lived in a particular way. They occupied a particular social position. The British landed gentry, the French grande bourgeoisie, the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy. They were not ashamed of not working. Not working was the point. It was the social signal of their position. They were distinct from the professional classes who earned their living, the doctor, the barrister, the military officer, respectable but not in the same league. And they were absolutely distinct from the working classes who sold their labor. The social order was visible in the relationship to work, or rather to the absence of it. Today's emerging rentier class is less socially distinct. The Silicon Valley billionaire works, obsessively, conspicuously. He broadcasts his work ethic, 16-hour days, sleeping at the factory. The hedge fund manager works, brutally hard. The celebrity entrepreneur works, or at least performs working. But the income they earn from capital has long since exceeded what they need for any conceivable consumption. Their work is not economically necessary for their survival. It is chosen, optional. They are rentiers who happen to also work. Or more precisely, they are workers who have accumulated enough capital to be rentiers, but who continue to work because they find it meaningful or because the culture rewards visible effort. The economic reality of the rentier and the cultural performance of the worker coexist in the same person. Let me bring in a comparison that Piketty uses, and that is genuinely illuminating. The heirs of the great fortunes versus the self-made wealthy. Piketty examines the Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans across several decades. In 1987, when Forbes began publishing the list, a relatively large proportion of the wealthiest Americans were self-made, first-generation wealth, people who had built something. By the 2010s and 2020s, the balance had shifted. Inherited wealth was representing a larger and growing share of the largest fortunes. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune built by Sam Walton, collectively hold wealth of roughly $250 to $270 billion. Sam Walton died in 1992. His children and grandchildren have not built a new Walmart. They hold shares in the existing one. They collect dividends. They attend board meetings. Some of them are involved in philanthropy. They are in economic function rentiers. And they represent exactly what Piketty is talking about when he says the world is moving back toward an inheritance society. The self-made billionaire is real, but the inherited billionaire is becoming increasingly common. And as existing fortunes compound, inherited wealth will account for a growing share of the ultra-wealthy. There is a specific mechanism in the United States that is particularly relevant here. The step-up in basis rule. This is one of the most consequential and least known provisions in the American tax code. When you die and leave appreciated assets to your heirs, those assets get a stepped-up cost basis. What does that mean in practice? If you bought a share for $1 and it is worth $1,000 when you die, you have an unrealized capital gain of $999. You have never paid tax on that gain because you never sold the share. When your heir receives that share, its new cost basis is $1,000, the current market value, not your original purchase price. Your heir can sell it immediately and pay no capital gains tax at all. The $999 gain disappears from the tax system entirely. This is not a small loophole. It is estimated to cost the United States Treasury approximately $50 billion a year in foregone tax revenue. $50 billion a year, that the very wealthy pass to the next generation completely untaxed through this single provision. President Biden attempted to reform it. The proposal was removed from the Build Back Better legislation before it passed under pressure from moderate Democrats who represented districts with wealthy constituents. Capital defends itself, quietly but effectively. Let me take you to the other end of the wealth spectrum, because the rentier story has a mirror image that is equally important. If the very wealthy are seeing their capital compound rapidly, what is happening to the wealth of those at the bottom? Piketty is explicit about this. The bottom 50% of the wealth distribution in most wealthy countries owns almost nothing. In the United States, the bottom 50% owns approximately 2% of total wealth. 2% for half the population. Their assets are mainly household possessions, perhaps a modest pension pot, a small amount of savings. And many in the bottom 50% have negative net wealth. They owe more than they own. Student loans, car loans, credit card debt, medical debt in the United States. When your net wealth is negative, the dynamics of capital work against you rather than for you. You pay interest rather than receiving it. The return on capital for someone with negative net wealth is not 5% in your favor. It is 15 or 20% credit card interest working against you. The divergence between those at the top of the wealth distribution and those at the bottom is not just a difference in degree. It is a difference in kind. The wealthy accumulate, the indebted erode. The mathematics of compound interest is generous to one group and punishing to the other. And this creates what Piketty identifies as one of the most dangerous aspects of the current trajectory. The possibility of a society where the divide between those who own capital and those who do not becomes so wide, so persistent, and so self-reinforcing that it cannot be bridged within a single lifetime by ordinary individual effort. Where starting without capital means struggling to accumulate any across an entire working life. Where starting with capital means watching it multiply to a level you could never approach through work. Where the two groups stop interacting, stop understanding each other, stop sharing civic space. This is not melodrama. It is the sociological implication of the mathematical dynamics. When capital concentrates sufficiently, it creates parallel worlds. The world of those who live off capital and the world of those who live off labor. With diminishing contact, diminishing shared interest, diminishing capacity for the collective action that democratic politics requires. The economist Branko Milanovic has called this the inequality of life chances rather than inequality of outcomes. It is not just that some people have more than others at any given moment. It is that the probability of your life unfolding in a certain way is determined substantially by where you start, by what capital your family holds when you are born. This is the society that a persistently high and rising capital-to-income ratio produces. Not inevitable, but the destination of the current trajectory, absent deliberate intervention. Part 4: Europe, America, and the convergence that never came. One of the genuinely surprising findings in Chapter 9 is what Piketty shows about the comparison between European and American wealth concentration. The common assumption, reinforced by decades of political rhetoric about American dynamism versus European sclerosis, is that Europe is the more equal society. Higher taxes, stronger welfare states, more union power, less raw capitalism, more equality. This is true for labor income. European labor income is less unequally distributed than American. But for wealth, for capital ownership, the picture in the 19th century was the reverse. Europe, particularly Britain and France, had dramatically more concentrated wealth than the United States in the 19th century. Remember, the Old World had centuries of accumulated capital, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, the colonial fortunes, the great banking dynasties. The New World had the frontier, land abundance, cheap land for settlers, a lower capital-to-income ratio, a less concentrated wealth distribution. America really was more equal in the 19th century, not because of better values, because of geography and factor endowments. Then the 20th century compressed European wealth dramatically through war and taxation, and expanded American wealth with relatively less redistribution. And from roughly 1980 onward, American wealth concentration has risen faster than European. Today, the United States has both higher labor income inequality and higher wealth concentration than most comparable European countries. The frontier is long gone. The institutional counterweights that replaced it, unions, welfare states, progressive taxation, were weaker in America than in Europe and have been eroded further since the 1980s. America has completed the journey from New World equality to Old World concentration in about a century and a half. In record time, historically speaking. Let me give you the numbers. In France in 2010, the top 10% held approximately 60% of total wealth. In the United States in 2010, the top 10% held approximately 72% of total wealth. A significant difference. The French 10% is already striking. The American figure is extraordinary. But the really dramatic number is the top 1%. In France, the top 1% held approximately 20 to 25% of total wealth. In the United States, the top 1% held approximately 35%. And the trend lines diverge further. Since 2010, American wealth concentration has continued to rise faster than French. The Federal Reserve's distributional financial accounts show that, by 2023, the top 1% of Americans held approximately 38% of all American wealth. 38% for 1% of people. The Gini coefficient for wealth in the United States is now above 0.8. For context, a Gini coefficient of 0 means perfect equality, everyone holds the same share. A Gini of 1 means perfect inequality, one person holds everything. 0.8 is close to the extreme end of conceivable inequality. The United States is not quite at Belle Epoque levels yet, but it is heading there, and it is getting there faster than France or Germany or the Scandinavian countries. Why has American wealth concentration risen faster? Several converging factors. First, as we discussed, the greater weakening of labor institutions in America, lower minimum wages, weaker unions, thinner welfare state. These factors increase inequality of labor income, which compounds into greater inequality of wealth accumulation over time. Second, the estate tax, the inheritance tax, in America is weaker in practice than it appears on paper. As we discussed, the step-up in basis rule and generous exemption thresholds mean that very large fortunes are transmitted between generations with remarkably little tax. Third, the financialization of the American economy. The financial sector is proportionally larger in the United States than in most European countries. Financial assets, stocks, bonds, derivatives, private equity make up a larger share of American wealth, and financial wealth is highly concentrated. Fourth, the technology sector. Silicon Valley has created a new generation of very large fortunes extraordinarily quickly. The pace at which Bezos, Musk, Zuckerberg, and their cohort accumulated wealth in the 2010s and 2020s was faster than almost any comparable accumulation in economic history. Amazon went from startup to the largest retailer in the world in about 25 years. The speed of wealth creation, and its concentration in a handful of founders, has no real historical parallel. And because American capital gains taxes are relatively low, much of this wealth has accumulated without significant taxation. The combination of fast accumulation and low taxation is a formula for rapid concentration. Scandinavia remains the most interesting counterexample. Because you might expect that countries with the most generous welfare states, the highest taxes, and the most egalitarian political cultures would also have the lowest wealth concentration. And in terms of income inequality, the Scandinavian countries are indeed among the most equal in the world. But here is the surprise. Wealth concentration in Sweden and Denmark, while lower than in the United States, is not dramatically lower than in France. The top 10% in Sweden hold roughly 60 to 65% of wealth. Not wildly different from France, and the top 1% share is substantial. Why? Partly because the Scandinavian welfare states have compressed income inequality, but have not directly attacked wealth concentration through large wealth taxes. Sweden abolished its wealth tax in 2007, Norway still has one, Denmark does not. And partly because Sweden has some very large concentrated fortunes. The Wallenberg family alone controls an extraordinary share of Swedish corporate assets, through their holding company, Investor Op. The Wallenbergs are Sweden's answer to the Rothschilds, a single family exercising significant influence over a substantial portion of the national economy. Through interlocking shareholdings, through board positions, through a network of relationships with political and business elites built over more than a century. The Swedish social democratic model compressed income inequality dramatically. It did not eradicate capital concentration at the very top. The lesson: progressive income taxation and strong welfare states are necessary but not sufficient for addressing wealth concentration. Directly taxing wealth, the stock, not just the flow, may also be required. Let us look at Japan. Because Japan is perhaps the most interesting and least discussed case in the comparative analysis of wealth concentration. Japan experienced one of the most dramatic forced redistributions of wealth in the 20th century outside of communist revolutions. The American occupation after 1945 imposed a comprehensive program of land reform and economic redistribution. The pre-war zaibatsu, the great industrial conglomerates controlled by a handful of family groups, were broken up. Land was redistributed from landlords to tenant farmers. Hundreds of thousands of smallholders received land they had previously farmed for others. Progressive taxation was introduced at rates comparable to the United States under Roosevelt. And Japan rebuilt from this redistributed base into an economic powerhouse. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Japan combined extraordinary economic growth with relatively low income and wealth inequality by wealthy country standards. Then from the late 1980s, Japan experienced its own version of the financialization and deregulation wave, an asset bubble of extraordinary proportions in real estate and equities. When the bubble burst in 1990, Japan entered what became called the lost decade, eventually the lost 2 decades. Deflation, stagnation, corporate zombies kept alive by bank forbearance. And through this long stagnation, wealth concentration in Japan has remained lower than in the United States. Partly because the bubble's collapse destroyed a great deal of financial wealth, partly because Japanese corporate governance norms and social norms around pay inequality have maintained stronger egalitarian pressures. Japan is a reminder that there are many paths to different capital distributions, and that the burst of a financial bubble, while catastrophic in other ways, can compress wealth concentration. The 2008 financial crisis in America and Europe had this effect briefly. Asset prices fell, wealthy portfolios shrank. But then central banks flooded the system with liquidity and asset prices recovered and rose above their pre-crisis levels, and wealth concentration continued rising. The compression that financial crises produce is typically temporary. Without structural changes to the institutional framework, the concentration reasserts itself. Part 5: What is to be done? The politics of capital. We have arrived at the part of any serious engagement with Piketty where the analysis has to confront the politics. Because describing the problem, capital concentration, the comeback of the rentier, the reassertion of inheritance over merit is one thing. Doing something about it is another. And Piketty is honest about the scale of the political challenge. The forces that have driven capital concentration are not external shocks like war or pandemic. They are embedded in the normal functioning of contemporary capitalism. And the interests that benefit from capital concentration are powerful. They have political influence. They have media presence. They have legal resources. They have the ability to threaten capital flight if policies they dislike are enacted. Changing this is not impossible. History shows it can be done. But it requires sustained political will of a kind that is not currently present in most wealthy countries. So what would it take? Let us be specific. The first and most fundamental instrument Piketty discusses in Chapter 9, and in subsequent chapters, is the progressive wealth tax. Not a tax on income, not a tax on capital gains when assets are sold, but an annual tax on the total stock of wealth held. The logic is straightforward. Capital income inequality is driven by the differential return on capital. Larger fortunes earn higher rates of return. An income tax, even a progressive one, does not directly address this, because much of the return on very large capital holdings is unrealized. It accumulates as capital gains that are never sold and never taxed. A wealth tax reaches this unrealized accumulation directly. Piketty's proposal, developed most fully in his later writing, is a progressive global wealth tax, low rates on modest wealth, rising rates on very large fortunes. Something like no tax on the first 250,000 euros of net wealth, 1% on wealth between 250,000 and 1 million, 2% on wealth between 1 million and 5 million, higher rates above that. The revenues would be substantial, and the effect on wealth concentration over time would be to slow the compounding that drives the richest further ahead. The word global is crucial there, and not just aspirational. It is a genuine policy requirement. A wealth tax imposed by one country alone is vulnerable to capital flight. If France taxes wealth at 2% per year, wealthy French citizens move their assets to Switzerland or Luxembourg or Singapore. This happened partially with the French ISF wealth tax. International coordination is the only answer to international capital mobility. And here, as we discussed in Chapter 3, there has been real if insufficient progress. The OECD's Global Minimum Corporate Tax, agreed in 2021, established the principle that international coordination on capital taxation is possible. The G20 discussion of a global billionaire minimum tax in 2024 extended that principle further. The political resistance is real. Small financial centers, Ireland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Singapore, have strong economic incentives to resist. But the balance of political power is not static. When large economies, the United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, agree that they want more effective taxation of global capital, they have enough market power to create meaningful pressure on holdouts. Ireland's eventual acceptance of the OECD minimum corporate tax is evidence of this. Ireland resisted, then agreed, because the alternative was worse. The same dynamic can apply to wealth taxes. If the major economies commit seriously, the architecture of international tax avoidance can be dismantled, not overnight, not completely, but substantially. The second instrument is estate tax reform. Inheritance taxes in most wealthy countries are riddled with exemptions and loopholes that make them largely ineffective at their stated purpose of preventing hereditary dynasties. As we discussed, the step-up in basis rule in America alone costs $50 billion a year. Closing that loophole, applying inheritance taxes at meaningful rates on large estates, requiring that gifts during life be treated similarly to bequests at death to prevent avoidance. These reforms would not eliminate inheritance. Piketty is not proposing to eliminate it. He is proposing that very large inheritances, the kind that reproduce hereditary economic power, should be more heavily taxed, while smaller inheritances, the family home, modest savings, should be lightly taxed or untaxed. The goal is not equality of outcome. It is preventing the emergence of a hereditary plutocracy. There is a meaningful moral distinction between a child inheriting their parents' home, which represents a lifetime of work compressed into an asset, and a child inheriting $200 million in financial assets, which represents the compound return on capital accumulated over generations without being meaningfully taxed. Current policy treats these two cases identically or nearly so. That is not a neutral position. It is a political choice, and it can be made differently. The third instrument, which Piketty discusses less in Chapter 9 but develops elsewhere, is the idea of universal capital endowments. We mentioned Thomas Paine's 1797 proposal earlier. The basic idea: if capital concentration is the problem, and if inheritance is the mechanism by which it reproduces, then one response is to extend some version of inheritance to everyone. Give every citizen a meaningful capital stake at the start of adult life, funded by a tax on large inheritances and large wealth holdings. In Britain, the Child Trust Fund, introduced in 2002 and abolished in 2010, was a modest version of this. Every child born received a government contribution into a savings account accessible at 18. It was too small to be transformative, but the principle was right. A more ambitious version, as proposed by economists like Fabian Wendt, or as Piketty and Emmanuel Sees have developed, would give every young adult a capital endowment of perhaps €60,000, funded by a progressive wealth tax and inheritance tax revenues. €60,000 is not enough to never work, but it is enough to start a small business, to avoid the worst student debt, to make a down payment on a modest home, to provide real options that most young people currently do not have. It is the difference between starting life with a safety net and starting without one. And the evidence suggests that having even a modest capital buffer dramatically changes economic decision-making. People with assets take productive risks. Without assets, they are forced into risk aversion. You cannot start a business if missing the first month's revenue means you cannot pay rent. Let us be honest about the scale of the political challenge. Because Piketty is, and we should be too. The reforms he proposes face obstacles that are not primarily technical. The economics of progressive wealth taxes are well understood. The international coordination mechanisms exist in principle. The obstacles are political. The wealthy have disproportionate political influence, as we discussed. They use that influence to block wealth taxes and inheritance tax reform. The ideological framework of the past 40 years that markets are efficient, that redistribution hurts growth, that the wealthy deserve what they have because they earned it, has deep roots. It does not disappear just because Piketty publishes data contradicting it. And there is a genuine conservatism among middle-class homeowners who have accumulated modest wealth and fear that any wealth tax might affect them, even when the proposals carefully exempt modest fortunes. The political coalition for progressive wealth taxation requires middle-class homeowners to identify their interests with the propertyless rather than with the wealthy. This is a harder sell than it might appear, especially in societies where the aspiration to accumulate more wealth is deeply embedded in the culture. And yet the history Piketty has documented shows that it has been done. The progressive income tax rates of the New Deal era, the inheritance taxes of the post-war period, the capital levies imposed after both world wars to pay off war debts. In Britain in 1919, David Lloyd George's coalition government imposed a one-time levy on capital to help pay off the national debt accumulated during the First World War. Not a permanent tax, a one-time levy. The wealthy screamed. The City of London predicted catastrophe. The levy was implemented. The catastrophe did not come. The economy continued. In the United States, the top marginal income tax rate remained above 70% from 1936 to 1980. This is a very long time. 44 years of very high taxation of top incomes. during which the American economy performed exceptionally well by almost any measure. Productivity rose, wages rose, innovation continued, companies invested. The argument that taxing high incomes and large capital holdings destroys economic dynamism is not supported by the experience of the 44 years during which America did exactly that. It is a claim about incentives that sounds plausible in an economics seminar, but it has very limited empirical support. Let me end Part 5 and Chapter 9 with a thought about what is actually at stake. Piketty ends his analysis of capital inequality not with a set of policy recommendations, but with a question about democracy. Democracy in its modern liberal form rests on a principle. One person, one vote, equal political standing regardless of wealth. This principle is never fully realized. Wealthy individuals and interests have always had more political influence than ordinary citizens. But there are thresholds. Beyond a certain level of capital concentration, the formal equality of the ballot box becomes increasingly disconnected from the actual distribution of power. When a small number of individuals own a significant fraction of the national capital, and when that capital gives them control over media, over political donations, over the employment of large numbers of people, over the legal resources to challenge regulations, the equality of the ballot matters less and less. The wealthy do not need to control every vote. They need only to ensure that the menu of choices on offer to voters does not include options that seriously threaten their capital. And historically, concentrated capital has proven remarkably effective at doing exactly this. Not through crude corruption alone, through the subtler, more pervasive influence of controlling the terms of the debate. What counts as a reasonable policy? What counts as economically irresponsible? What counts as outside the mainstream? These definitions are not neutral. They are shaped by interests, and the interests with the most resources to shape them are the interests of concentrated capital. Piketty's project is, at its deepest level, an attempt to make these mechanisms visible, to name what is happening in the data, to provide the analytical tools for citizens to understand the world they are living in. The rest, what to do about it, is, as always, a political question. And political questions are answered by people, by citizens who understand what they are choosing, or by citizens who do not. The difference matters. End of Chapter 9.